Hi. Thank you, Dina, for that lovely introduction and for giving me a tour of some exhibitions today. And I just had a really relaxing day, which was really nice, and put me in a good mood to share my work with y'all. Today I'm going to share some new work, some old work. It'll be a sort of meandering through my thinking and process. So I hope it sort of like enlightens you into how I think about making work, where the final object is sort of like just one phase in this ongoing like kaleidoscopic, I don't know, web or entanglement of thinking and experiencing and everything. So in my presentation, it's like, some references, some final work, some like sketches. It's kind of everything sort of mixed into each other. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn shit down, we will inevitably see more and see differently, and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. And this is a quote from Jack Halberstam in the intro to The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. And I think about this quote a lot, just in terms of like thinking about what are future realities we'd like to create for ourselves and what, potential those can provide to us. And it's something I explore a lot in my work.
America, we as a people need to revive our nation's faith in God. It is now, more than ever, that we need to focus on the here and now. Our people need to be uplifted. We need to know what's going on the ground. The space program that drove so many of our pioneers to outer space is something we can no longer afford to do. While so many of us here, breathing, living, building on Earth are in need of saving. Past the past. We're focused on the future. This is the update. We are the update. That's all we need to do as a species, is to update together. We plan to create millions of jobs across education, fashion, communication, computers, and science. Hard-working Americans who have been left behind by the private economy and tax break for the rich will finally have the opportunities they deserve to get their dignity back, to take care of their family. That's not just my plan. That's God's plan. I can see 100 years into the future, and I will be the one to bring that future here to the present. You should trust me more than anyone else, more than Elon, more than Jobs, or any politician. What politician do you know is an engineer? As a black man in America, I understand this country in many ways, some never will. What black president has come to your neighborhood? I've seen things, done things only God can see. I've been tested, put through the fire more than once. So I know what it takes to make it through the war by Obama, the Space Force by Trump, the epidemic unleashed by Biden. That wasn't on God's time. They can't get rid of us. By following faith, we'll be the type of nation, the type of people God intended us to be. I am Christopher Donner, and I approve of this message.
The 2024 presidential candidate you may or may not be looking for. State. So I grew up in Pasadena, California, outside of Los Angeles, and a lot of the work I've been making over the last several years has dealt with things like policing or the growth of high technology or innovation of high technology and sort of like who is included in those decision-making processes. I've also thought about how those things are related to the university system and prison and incarceration. And in many ways, a lot of the work I've been doing has like taken me back to thinking about California, thinking about something like Silicon Valley taking place near San Francisco, or the heavy prison system within California. So I think it's sort of like an interesting place to start in talking about what it is I've been doing. So what I want to start with is this project I've been doing for the last few years, which is jumping off from Octavia Butler, the science fiction author, which I hope many of you are familiar with, and looking at her life and work, and something that kind of like sent me in a spiral of sort of like thinking about what she was doing and what her life experiences were, is like finding out that she grew up in the same town I did in Pasadena, and we also went to the same high school. So this is a button pin in her archive from John Muir High School, which is where I also went to high school. And so this project is kind of like thinking about what it meant for her to grow up in that place. And she grew up at a time when it was very segregated, and wasn't surrounded by a lot of people that were encouraging her to become a science fiction author, but she had a lot of like tenacity in sort of pursuing that path. And so I sort of like saw a relationship and thinking about myself as like a young, weird kid in that area, wanting to make art, and just sort of like now seeing what it is she's been able to accomplish. And so I thought about that, and I also thought about what were some of the things that maybe she witnessed growing up there. There's a lot of like rocket science history in Pasadena, and also the legacy of like black families migrating from the southern United States to the western United States. So it's sort of become this like all-encompassing project of thinking about all these connections and things that sort of like led to her being who she was. After all, the subversive intellectual came under false pretenses, with bad documents out of love. Her labor is as necessary as it is unwelcome. And this is another quote from the Undercommons, but I like this quote as sort of like a way to think about what it is that Butler was able to do. So this is an image of a map that I came across. I read this essay called Geographical Perspectives on the History of Black America. And I liked the graphic aesthetically, but also this diagram sort of illustrates what is referred to as like the Great Migration, and also the Second Great Migration, which was when a lot of black people left the southern United States either to go north to Chicago, New York, and ultimately also many people went west towards Los Angeles and Upper California. And so those large white dots sort of represent where black people were migrating to. And the reason for a lot of this obviously had to do with like escaping racial terrorism within the southern United States, but also, trying to find work opportunities and like the rise of industry. But oftentimes people talk about the Great Migration, where people went to the north, but it's less commonly talked about people also going west. And so I sort of like trace a similarity in Butler's family moving from Louisiana to Los Angeles, and my own family moving from Oklahoma and Tennessee to Southern California. So this is an image, another archival image of Octavia Butler's, which references the desert that I think is really beautiful. But also this is a photo that she took in Barstow, California, when she was doing research for these sort of like desert images that kind of are similar to what you might imagine Martian terrain might look like. I'll tell you where part of the burning thing comes from. One of my earliest memories is being carried out of a burning house in the middle of, I guess you could say it was the burning desert, only it was night. My grandmother has a chicken ranch out between Victorville and Barsdale here in California. So this is from an interview with Octavia Butler, and she reflects on her grandmother having this farm in the California desert. So after her grandmother migrated to California, she had this farm and she had chickens there as well. And one of Octavia Butler's earliest memories is being carried out of this burning building. And you see fire as sort of like a trope that occurs commonly in many of her novels that represents, these sort of like intense transitional moments for a lot of her characters. And I think that sort of ties in with this early memory of hers. And I started to think about this architectural form of this chicken coop that her grandmother had in Victorville, as representing this early moment of her family trying to like create a form of autonomy by placemaking when they moved to California. And so I thought a lot about that farm burning down, and this image is just a tax map of that area in Victorville where her grandmother's ranch probably existed. And so I've consulted a lot with someone who's now a friend of mine, Ayanna Jameson, who's like an Octavia Butler scholar, and she sort of told me where this ranch may have been, and I went out there and like took some photos. So these are like places in Apple Valley, Victorville, where Octavia Butler's grandmother's house may have been at some point in time. And there's a photo of a Joshua tree there that I thought kind of resembled the photo that Octavia Butler took of a Joshua tree. Hello, nephew. As I mentioned to you in the text, drawing is not my forte. I tried to draw a chicken coop. Attached are some pictures when put together resembles what my memory of my grandparents' chicken coop looked like. This is the best I can do. I'm sorry, but I did not get your artistic abilities. I hope you can put together my vision. So that's from my aunt. And the reason she wrote that message is because I was kind of like trying to imagine what this chicken coop from like the 1940s may have looked like, and knowing that my own grandparents and great-grandparents had chickens, I kind of asked my aunts, like, can you give me any idea of what that would have looked like at that point in time? And she drew me this image, which is not super descriptive, but I thought it was kind of a beautiful artifact and sort of like another way to access that information that otherwise is like not available to me anymore. Imagine, I don't know if this is familiar to anyone, /imagine desert photo URL, coop photo URL, chicken coop without chickens in the desert, full color Panavision, Panaflex, 35 millimeter, aspect ratio 1:1. So this is a mid-journey prompt that I wrote to try and create images of what this chicken coop would have looked like. So after I consulted my aunts, I thought, okay, how else can I sort of like imagine what this chicken coop would have looked like? And so I inserted an image, one of the photos that I took in Victorville, and a photo I found of an old chicken coop, and from there was able to render some images of what I can imagine Octavia Butler's grandmother's chicken coop may have looked like. And for me, like, I ultimately intended to make like a sculptural work, so this was something I kind of did just as an experiment to see what might occur. But then the images I actually thought were really cool. And eventually I went to SketchUp and designed what I imagined this chicken coop could have looked like. And so I recently made the sculpture. I haven't shown it yet, but this is documentation of what it looks like. And so this is based on what I imagined the chicken coop could have looked like. And what I did was I made it also double as an archival repository for Octavia Butler's archival materials. So I've been to the Huntington Library in California many times to visit Octavia Butler's archive, where she donated everything that she had after she passed away, even down to like, drawings she made as a kid, or family, medical documents from like before she was even born, like really like all kinds of things. But I thought this would be an interesting way to kind of like convey this matrilineal heritage, from her grandmother who moved to moved to California from Louisiana, her mother who was a maid in white people's homes for her whole professional life, and then Octavia Butler becoming this writer that we know today, and her archival materials that exists now in this form of these like gray boxes. So within this chicken coop is holding these boxes. And they, have these labels that refer to the materials that are inside. So these ones here are subject files and research materials. The one on the left says subject files, Black people and Latinos. The one on the right says subject files, minorities. News. So again, this is another Butler-related project, but I've been referencing a lot the Parable of the Sower novel, which is one of Octavia Butler's most popular novels, really sort of had like a second renaissance during COVID. And in this novel, there's a reference to this window on this wealthy family's home. The family is the Giannis family, and they have sort of what I imagine is a mansion with this window wall that's also a television screen that sort of projects out into the neighborhood. And on it is like news and different syndicated television, and people come up to the television and they like buy fruit and things and they watch news, and that's kind of like, for some people, that's their only way to see what's going on in the world in this sort of dystopic near future California. And so I started collecting quotes in the book about this window, describing it, because I wanted to make a sculptural, version of this window. So some of the quotes: "Tonight, the last big window wall television in the neighborhood went dark for good. We saw the dead astronaut with all of the red, rocky Mars around her. We saw a dusty, dry reservoir and 3 dead water peddlers with their dirty blue armbands and their heads cut halfway off. And we saw whole blocks of boarded up buildings burning in Los Angeles. Of course, no one would waste water trying to put such fires out. The Giannis window is about as old as I am. It covers the long west wall of their living room." So this is the main character talking. She's like, I think she's 14 at the beginning of the novel. Her name's Lauren. And she says, "They've been charging admission, only letting in people from the neighborhood, and selling fruit juice, acorn bread, or walnuts. Whatever they had too much of in their garden, they found a way to sell." "I need to read or to hear the news every day so that I have at least the illusion of knowing what's going on, what people are doing, where we seem to be heading. I wrote Parable at least partly because I'm a news junkie. I might not have written this novel if I weren't a news junkie, as a way to fix the world." So Octavia Butler consumed a lot of news, listened to NPR a lot. She also clipped a lot of newspaper headlines. So this is something else from the archive. But I'm really interested in this idea of her being a news junkie and news being a recurring topic in that novel in particular. Some of the ways that we learn about what's happening in California is through these descriptions of news pieces that the characters are seeing. And so I thought it would be interesting to try and like recreate some of these things that the characters would have witnessed in the novel, rather than like, making videos that portray the events of the novel, but rather what are the media items that the characters would have been witnessing. And so trying to imagine the Giannis window, I was doing sketches of like different California style windows and homes. And if any of you have spent time in California, there's like particular architectural styles that are very prevalent or prominent. One of them being this sort of like arts and craftsman, turn of the century architecture. So this is an image of the Gamble House, which is a well-known Pasadena icon. And it's like this old house that's made of a lot of wood, and it has a lot of like curved edges and everything. And I was texting my friend about this. We're talking about the Gamble House. She says, "This is cool. Have you visited in person?" I said, "I was a docent there in middle school." So this is the most recent version of this piece, The Honest Window. So it's basically a standalone wooden window frame, and then there's a sort of window screen that also has video on it. So the video I showed you at the beginning is part of this series. There's currently 3 videos that I've made that show on the window, and the plan is to kind of keep making more videos so it feels more and more like you're watching television. And that video is a presidential ad for this character, Christopher Donner, who runs for president in Parable of the Sower. And they kind of describe his politics. He's like kind of populist. He's kind of like, you know, kind of conservative, but maybe not entirely. And they don't really describe him so much as like his ideas. And I tried to think of a contemporary, you know, equivalent to what this person is, and I thought of Kanye West. And so that became the sort of like visual language for this video. And this is from his 2020 presidential campaign video. And while we were filming this, the actor that I found, his name's Ajuma. He was younger than the actor I originally wanted to have. I expected to have someone older, but seeing him act, it also sort of made me think of Chris Smalls, who's the Amazon Labor Union president. So thinking of other sorts of political figures that we're getting in this contemporary moment. And because the novel Parable of the Sower takes place in 2024, I'm trying to think about what is actually happening right now that we're seeing that could have existed in this novel. And this is another image of the sculpture. And I'll play one more video for you that is on the screen.
Good evening. Tragic news tonight as we learn about the recent accident on a Mars landing where the young astronaut Alicia Catalina Godinez Leal fatally died this morning. The messages received from other missionaries on the site say that she experienced a puncture in her suit, leading to asphyxiation. 3 of her team members rushed to bring her back to the station, but unfortunately, by the time they returned, it was too late. Today, we'll be hearing Alicia's mother, Guadalupe Leal, in Barstow, California, reflect on her daughter's legacy.
I told her not to go. That space program is eating away. It's taking away all the money from here. We don't have any money. My brother and I, we don't have any money. We work very hard. And Alicia saw something up there. She saw an opportunity. I understand that. But my daughter is gone.
Everyone's familiar with the team of Mars missionaries that broke ground just 2 years ago as they plan to start terraforming the red planet so that it can one day be another place we call home. Tragedy struck as the youngest astronaut on the crew, who will be remembered for her optimistic personality and for being the spirit of the mission, met her fate while doing a routine outing to collect samples of new plant life being developed for the special environment. At the time of the accident, Alicia was taking samples only 2 kilometers from the Mars station, a mere 20 kilometers northeast of Octavia Butler Landing, the first station named on Mars. Reportedly, she was injured and her suit became damaged when a meteorite about the size of a dime tore through her suit unexpectedly. She paged her fellow astronauts for help, but they could not come quick enough to get her back to the station before she lost oxygen. Alicia graduated from university 2 years early as one of the best in her class and worked as a chemist for 2 years while applying to join the Mars mission that would involve working on some of the planet's first settlements.
I want to go to Mars because from our research that we've been conducting, we see that it might be one of the few planets that we can inhabit for years. I feel like humanity has been working towards this goal, perhaps not to Mars, but for a while now. Ever since we've noticed climate change, we've been very aware of climate change, and we want to make sure that our future generations have a place to live.
This is a terrible place we live in. It's been this way for 20 years. After they stop taxes, no one with any money is paying taxes. They put police all over. They don't protect things or keep anyone away. Everyone had money once, more than now. We weren't rich, but we could make a living. That is destroyed. They took that opportunity away. I blame them for making Alicia think that she has to go all the way to Mars. It's not right. All my sons are gone. They left. My youngest didn't make it. He was killed when someone came into our neighborhood and they wanted something they could sell. He tried to stop them and they shot him. That was the worst moment of my life until now.
When she was a little girl, I gave her this horse because she was always thinking to go on top of the horse and fly to the stars. She was a really, really curious child. She was really, really original with a great imagination. Yes, I miss her a lot. We miss her sister. It was incredible moments with her in life.
I grew up watching Alicia as a teenager, used to babysit her, and I just remember being, around the neighborhood, playing in the street with the other kids. Who knows why they invest in whatever, but it's costing billions of dollars to get people like Alicia into space so they can die, when we have everything right here in our immediate vicinity is going to crap. I mean, I like the idea of exploring space, but also people are starving, people don't have health insurance, the schools are not fully funded, so I love the idea of it, but maybe if we invested in our communities, then people like Alicia could find things that they could do here.
And there you have it, some of the concerns faced by California residents and much of the country that has suffered the most from the recent recession and climate crisis. Word has it that Leo's body will be returned to Earth for a funeral that the family will organize in her memory. It was Alicia's wish to be buried on Mars in the event of her death. However, her family was not willing to let go of her so easily. My heart goes out to the Leo family. We appreciate her mother being able to speak with us today during such a vulnerable moment. My name is Megan Reed. Stay tuned in to hear the Nightly Report.
Sunset. It is interesting to note here that the redaction of document 105969591 took the form of a whiteout, concealing a good portion of the original text with white blocks, in this way deviating from the method of censoring the redacted data with opaque black blocks, rendering any information in the dark. This is a quote from Simone Brown in Dark Matters. And she's referring to a document about Frantz Fanon that's a government document that has these like large whiteouts instead of like the familiar black redacted images. And I reference that book a lot in sort of thinking about redaction and also annotation. And this is an artwork that I made in 2015 to 2016, which was a year-long performance, or I called it an online performance. And this was kind of my first engagement with visual redaction. And for this year, what I did was the images that I would normally post on social media, I redacted them with this solid blue image. So every time I would want to post, I would post this blue image. I would print out the photo and archive it in an album. So there was just like one copy of the image. But virtually, you would only just see these like repeated blue images. But I sort of like think about that as sort of like a precedent for some of the other visual redaction that I did later on. By considering that relationship between imaging and imagining in the registers of Black annotation and Black redaction, I want to think about what these images call forth, and I want to think through what they call on us to do, think, feel in the wake of slavery, which is to say, in an ongoing present of subjection and resistance. And this is Christina Sharp. And I like these terms that she writes, Black annotation and Black redaction. Thinking about those in relationship to something like the government's redactive processes. There's been many times when artists, musicians, Black artists and musicians have used redaction or annotation sort of like as an intentional method. Redaction as a sort of means of self-protection, and annotation as a way of like adding to an archive that is otherwise missing information. So thinking of giving agency to those ideas of annotation and redaction. This is a video clip of a Minneapolis Target being looted during the protest after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So during that same time, I was living in New York. I primarily live in New York, though I'm currently in LA for a residency, but during that time, which was also during COVID, you saw a lot of businesses and things boarding up, and you also saw major museums boarding themselves up in anticipation of riots after the murder of George Floyd. And it was kind of interesting at the time. This is the Whitney Museum, by the way. The Whitney Museum was not open to the public, but they boarded themselves up in anticipation of something. And it got me kind of thinking about what does it mean to board up in anticipation of like a Black Lives Matter protest? Are they worried about things being stolen? And then it raises this question for me in a museum of like who even owns the objects in a museum? And so this is an image from 1897 of British looters in Benin after they raided the king's palace and stole a lot of artifacts that are now in Western museums. When every image in the museum seems to be boarded up, every item in the collection redacted, it makes it clear that you are not meant to enter the museum. I wanted to question whether a museum even owns the work it says it does, or if it is in fact all stolen and looted property. This is something that I said in conversation with Legacy Russell. So this is another image of the Whitney Museum on that long street on Gainesville after they already had it entirely boarded up. But that was not unique to the Whitney Museum. This is MoMA. This is the new museum. And there's another Whitney. And so basically, the reason I'm showing you all this, it was during this time that I was working on a commission for the Whitney Museum. They had approached me before like COVID had even started, but they do this ongoing series called Sunrise Sunset, which is a web-only like artist intervention onto their website. And while I was working on it, COVID happened, the museum was physically closed to the public, and the only way to access the museum was through the website. And then in addition to that, they were now boarding it up. And so I was thinking about what it means for the website to be the only access point for entering the museum. And so I created this piece called Looted, and essentially what would happen is the website would be blacked out and all of the images would be redacted with this plywood image. And for me, it represented what if these artworks were all stolen, essentially. And so all you're left with is their absence. And something that I found unique with the Whitney Museum's website is that their whole collection is visible online. So I thought it sort of added to this point of like, what if all these images and all these artworks were taken away? What is the museum left with? Plain. Between looking and being looked at, spectacle and spectatorship, enjoyment and being enjoyed, lies and moves the economy of what Saidiya Hartman calls hypervisibility. This is Fred Moten. So a lot of my work deals with surveillance and particularly thinking about racialized surveillance, which is also why I often reference Simone Brown's book, which has been really informative for me. And in that book, she uses this diagram, which I'm gonna try and explain. I've been like thinking about it for years, but it's still kind of hard to explain sometimes. But basically, surveillance represents when an entity in power observes or surveys someone not in power. And there's this surveillance theorist named Steve Mann who proposed this term surveillance, which is French for undersight, to think about what it means for someone not in power to observe someone in power. So you could think of it as a sort of inverse of surveillance. And he created this two-dimensional diagram to represent both of these types of valence happening at different amounts in different ways at different times. And valence being a sort of neutral act of watching. So valence is just watching, surveillance is top down, surveillance is bottom up. But because it's on two dimensions, what that means is you can have a presence or an absence of either of those things at any given time. So you can have surveillance and surveillance happening, and you can have an absence of either of those in one of those directions. And he kind of comes up with terms to represent these different types of valence. So when you have both, it's total valence, everyone's watching everyone. Anti-surveillance, when surveillance is sort of like prevented or made not possible. McValence is, McValence is when an establishment like McDonald's forbids patrons from recording while also recording them. So surveillance is prevented, but surveillance is happening. Univalence is if you're on a phone call with a group of people and one person is recording everyone. So that would be when you have surveillance and an absence of surveillance. So you don't need to get all of that right now, but I'm just trying to like give you a basis for what I'm gonna talk about. This is an image that I found that I thought was really interesting of the Ann Arbor police building a police radio tower, and this is a photo from 1940. But what I thought was interesting about it is them sort of like building this grid-like structure or like the square-like structure as a basis for this structure that's going to be used for like surveillance by the police. And just thinking about the grid or the square as a Cartesian model, so it's like, it's something that's used to basically, essentially like capture by nature or like if you're trying to like plot points on a graph, you're trying to like capture data or like be able to map it to understand it. So there's something essentially captive about this notion of the Cartesian grid. Using this model, but imagining man's valence plane as operating in 3 dimensions, I plot dark surveillance as an imaginative place from which to mobilize a critique of racializing surveillance, a critique that takes form in anti-surveillance, counter-surveillance, and other freedom practices. And so this is Simone Brown, and in her book, she uses this 2-dimensional model, but she basically says, Steve Mann, the person that designed this, isn't accounting for the way that racialization has a hand in surveillance, and it sort of changes the dynamic of any surveillance or surveillance dynamic. So she proposes that there needs to be a 3rd dimension onto this model that accounts for how race plays into it. And she also proposes this term, dark surveillance. So remember, surveillance is undersight. Dark surveillance she uses to represent strategies that enslaved people had used to sort of like undermine forms of surveillance that were being used against them. So tactics or strategies to evade surveillance used by captive slaves were something that she considered dark surveillance. So I got a little obsessed with this idea, and I wanted to try and like create an object that thought about what it would mean to have a 3rd dimension to this 2-dimensional model. And so this is a piece, it's called Valence Caliper, parentheses annotated. And in the middle is this black device that looks like some kind of measurement device or tool. On there, it says valence caliper in French. French because the language of valence is all French for some reason. And it has this vertical and horizontal bar that, could move, that you could use to like capture valence on 2 dimensions. But onto that structure is built this kind of cursory wooden structure where someone theoretically is trying to like locate these other forms of valence that are only in the 3rd dimension. So there's kind of like different notes jotted on it. And so presumably dark surveillance might exist somewhere in this quadrant. And next to dark surveillance, it says tactics employed to render oneself out of sight. Secure. So this is a drawing that is probably familiar to a lot of you from 1791, and this is a diagram of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. And yeah, I was commissioned to make a work for the Guggenheim for this exhibition Going Dark, which took place October to, I believe, March of this year, October last year to March this year. And this was an exhibition that focused on the figure, but thinking about the figure through this lens of visibility, ways that artists use figuration to make a figure more or less visible and think about the political dynamics of what it means to be visible in society. And Ashley James, the curator, asked me to create a work. Naturally, I wanted to do something not museum friendly. And through our conversations over time, I eventually kind of like noticed the eerie similarity between the design of the Guggenheim and the ideal model of a panopticon. And so in the panopticon, for those that aren't familiar, it was basically this model for like the ideal prison or factory, where in the center there's like one observation tower, and around the perimeter you have all these cells where prisoners would be. And so the person in the middle could observe everyone at the same time, and this central tower would be kind of like, you wouldn't be able to see inside of it, and it would probably have bright lights on it. So if you were captive in this prison, you would not know whether or not someone was in that tower. So they could watch you at any given moment. And so this is like an idea that was popularized by Michel Foucault to think about how discipline and punishment operates in the current era. But basically what happens when you can't know when someone's watching you is that you start to police yourself. And so this model is often referenced as a way to think about how people police themselves in a digital era as well. But basically, I just wanted to think about this notion of visibility in the context of the Guggenheim, which looks like the Panopticon minus the tower. So it has, you know, the rotunda with the different levels. It's a round building. Also, like, each of the artworks typically exists in what they call bays, which are kind of like cells. They have walls on each side of them as they go up the rotunda. And yeah, what would it mean to have a sort of like central observation system within the Guggenheim Museum? And this is a prison that exists in Cuba, but it's like the closest thing to like what the Panopticon would have looked like. So this work that I created, it's called Security Theater, which is again a reference to Simone Brown. But there was a hanging mysterious orb in the middle of the museum, which contained 8 really high-end cameras that each have like an AI built into them. And you basically had like a 360-degree view of the Guggenheim's interior. And so people would walk into the museum, they may or may not notice it. They kind of go up a few floors, and then there was a room that they could enter, which was also part of my work. But people didn't know what was inside, and if they wanted to come inside, they would have to wait in line, and they would have to present their phone to be locked up so that they wouldn't be able to use it for the remainder of their time in the museum. And so in thinking about how to do this, like around this time I had heard about these phone pouches, which some of you have probably seen at different events or something. But there's this phone pouch that's used, I heard it was used at like Takeoff's funeral, but it's also used by a lot of comedians. Dave Chappelle is like a big supporter of this company. But basically you would have to put your phone in this case and then you wouldn't be able to use it until you leave the museum. And you enter into the room and there's this grid of TV monitors that kind of present a 360-degree view of the rotunda of the museum. And on the screens, humans are identified by these red boxes. And so once you get inside the room, first of all, you're sort of like realizing that you've been watched the whole time and you probably didn't know, but also kind of like sitting and watching how the AI kind of decides who or what is human. And it also kind of like recognized artwork sometimes as human, or some people wouldn't get recognized as human. So it was also kind of like interesting to see how this complex AI system thinks about humanity. And this type of camera that we use is something that would be used in like a train station in like a really big city or like a factory, something that's really like robust and can kind of like immediately identify certain traits around people. It was something where if you were to upload a photo of a specific person, it could, you know, track that person down constantly and very easily. Or you could sort of like identify certain traits that it would use to decide who it's going to watch or not watch. And the title security theater comes from this concept of something we see like when you go to the airport and you go through the TSA line and it seems like really dramatic and over the top, like the way they yell at you and the rules are always changing. And security theater is kind of this idea that there's a performance of security that sort of goes beyond what is actually necessary for your safety in order to sort of like intimidate you or keep you feeling subjected, which I think relates to this idea of how the panopticon would be used to essentially make passive subjects of people that were being watched. So, and it's also like kind of a theater when you go in the room and you get to watch the screen itself. And as you leave the museum, that's when you kind of go to this booth and you can like get your phone back. And I also just wanted to take people's phones away. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. So if there's any questions, I can answer some questions.
Yes, we have microphones.
Hi. Thank you for that. Super interesting, this survey of your work. I'd like to ask about your interest in grids and frames.
What did you say?
I'd like to ask about your interest in grids and frames, right? Throughout every work that you showed up until the Panopticon one, I'm thinking about the window frame from the Gamble House, for instance, even the Facebook piece with the blue frames. It seems like it read to me like you were citing gridded or minimalist paintings from the mid-century or modernist painting. And the piece that you made, the three-dimensional version of the surveillance graph was also a kind of frame. And the balloon frame, quite famously, was invented in California. I'm interested in why you're using these frames and grids as holding devices for content. If I'm reading that wrongly, please correct me, because the work obviously doesn't have to be contained in these frames, right?
Yeah, I think that you kind of alluded to like a history of minimalism, which I do think about and maybe want to like I don't know, I think I draw a lot from like early conceptualism, but sort of think about what it could do now or how it might operate differently. So I could see a relationship there, but yeah, it's sort of just a formal device. I think part of it is trying to identify what are traits that could be carried across the different works that feel like something familiar. I don't know if I agree that they could all be different forms. I mean, I think like with something like the Facebook piece, it's sort of subject to what are the dimensions of the software itself. But yeah, I think I'm just sort of like interested in that shape, perhaps.
Thank you for your talk. I had more like a logistic question about your last work in the museum. How is it possible to like have this AI and like all the information, are they given to a company, like, because it's always trained? How do you like protect the visitors of the museum, or is it a consideration you had?
Yeah. So the museum does have its own closed circuit surveillance system already, which records, but I was not allowed for this surveillance system to record people, so it's only live. So what you're seeing is like the only time you would see it. It's not recorded. And it also happens like the AI processing of like what is human happens within the camera itself, because there's like a hardware in the camera. But also like the displaying of it happens through a computer that's like in that room with the screens. So it all happens like on site and it's not retained. So like I wouldn't be able to like access it or see it off site or like after the fact.
Hey, Jacinta, hi, thank you so much for your time, and I'm just, so glad I got a chance to see your presentation. But I have a question about whether it's your name change or the work that you talked about, particularly with the chicken coop and autonomy, are you influenced by ideas of marronage and also say like glissance opacity, like right to opacity? Is that something that also informs your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think about this idea of like opacity or redaction, or like the idea of having agency over how you present very much, especially in that early work, like the Facebook work. In that moment, I was thinking a lot about like how we are asked or made to present ourselves in digital space, or expected to, and wanting to have agency over that and sort of like make a visible declaration that kind of showed like a redaction or like a refusal. The piece was called A Refusal. So it was about like making a, conspicuous intervention into the platform that made visible my decision to like refuse rather than just like leaving the platform. So I do think a lot about like the politics of opacity or being visible. Marronage, I can't say I'm as familiar with, yeah.
So like in Jamaica and a lot of, anywhere there's been enslaved people, there have been communities that have stolen off and they support themselves independently however they can. And that's what it reminded me of with Arcadia Butler's grandmother's chicken coop in Europe. So like gardening or plantation plots that they sold there.
Yeah, I can see that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm wondering if you ever considered adding a racial component to security theater?
Adding a racial component?
Yeah.
Well, I believe it's there, though maybe not as explicitly as some of the other work I've done, but I think even the way that the AI is like able to decide who is human or not has to do with like your, like how visible you are within the digital camera, which I think inherently does have to do with race. And also like when I was like meeting this company, like they came to the museum and they were like doing this demo about all the crazy things this software could do. Like I was sort of like asking them these questions about how it sort of like, chooses what to identify and like what are the sort of like characteristics that it can use to identify someone. And I mean, they were very like evasive about how they described it, but it's like inherently baked into how these types of systems operate that like of course race is already there in the same way that they're built out of our society, which always has vision racialized. So I do believe it's there, even if it's not like as explicitly said as other works.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for showing us your work. I was wondering if the themes of redaction and surveillance kind of bled into each other or had influences on each other in those two separate projects, specifically in the digital world and in your Facebook page.
Yeah, definitely. With a refusal, I think it's like there's surveillance that happens like within digital space just by like deciding to participate. That I think it's kind of disturbed when you start to mess with it by having these different interventions, like messing with your name or your photo or things like that. Even thinking about like Facebook when they started using AI to like recognize like, oh, your friend is in this photo and things like that. So at the time I made that project, I wasn't thinking as much about surveillance. I was more thinking about digital labor and like what it means to like perform as someone online. But I think it's kind of natural that it leads into these projects that deal with surveillance more directly.
Last question here. Okay, hi, thank you so much for your talk. I found it really insightful and inspiring. And I had a question about your process because in each of the pieces you showed us, it felt like you were responding to something, and so many of your pieces seem to be rooted in theory and in thinkers. So I wanted to ask, like, how do you decide what to work on and what to respond to, especially with like so much happening in the world? And I also wanted to ask, like, what are you thinking about now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it has to do with like if I look historically at the projects I've made, a lot of times I'll be like really interested in a particular topic or something that I'm reading about. And then that combined with like, you know, a deadline results in like a decision being made about what I'm gonna do, which is something I'm kind of trying to move away from. Like I kind of want to get, I don't want to be as responsive to like different opportunities that are happening, but rather be able to sort of make things and then I can show it somewhere, which is very optimistic. But yeah, I think that the change that will happen in that process, and I'm starting to notice it now, is sort of like being able to think more abstractly about like what is a long-term interest that I want to cultivate in my work, rather than like, oh, I just want to like present this one idea, or a lot of times I do a sort of like body of work. Like I did a lot of work around policing, surveillance, and I'm doing this project about Octavia Butler, but I want to kind of move away from like bodies of work and be able to make works that more like the Guggenheim piece that are sort of like discrete works. But I would say like the overall arch that I'm experiencing, I was making a lot of work critical of the police, and then like up until 2020, and then I was feeling a bit burnt out, and then around that time that I was doing that work, I was kind of thinking about speculative fiction as a tool for like abolitionist thinking, or like ways outside of a carceral means of doing things. And that was around when I started to work on the Octavia Butler work, which obviously is like based in speculative fiction. And so for me, I kind of see a natural progression as like thinking about abolitionist practice, like how can speculative fiction have a relationship to that, but not super explicitly. Like I don't want to necessarily like make sci-fi in like a traditional sense, but I do want to think about using maybe like the methodology of sci-fi to like imagine other possibilities. And yeah, I don't know yet what that looks like, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much, American Artists. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you.